They tried to evict me from the home I built for my wife, using fake papers. I stood my ground, issued an ultimatum, and the fallout stunned the family. When my daughter called me that Tuesday afternoon, I thought she wanted to catch up over coffee. Instead, she delivered news that would shatter everything I believed about family, loyalty, and the boundaries of human decency. What happened next would test every principle I'd built my life upon and ultimately force me to make a choice that would change our relationship forever. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The phone rang just as I was finishing my second cup of morning coffee, the kind of perfectly timed interruption that should have felt normal. My daughter Sarah's voice came through the speaker with that particular brightness she used when she wanted something, though I couldn't have imagined the magnitude of what she was about to ask. "Dad, I need to talk to you about the lake house," she said, her words carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Marcus and I have been thinking, and we've decided that his parents should move in permanently. They're struggling financially, and the place is just sitting empty most of the time anyway." I set down my coffee cup, the ceramic making a sharp click against the granite countertop I had installed myself 3 summers ago. The lake house wasn't just property to me. It was the culmination of 43 years of backbreaking construction work, every overtime shift and weekend project that had built my company from a single pickup truck into something substantial. More importantly, it was where Margaret and I had planned to spend our golden years together, watching grandchildren play in the same waters where we'd honeymooned 34 years earlier. "Sarah, sweetheart, I think there might be some confusion here," I said, choosing my words carefully. "The lake house belongs to me. I can't just hand it over to Marcus's parents without some kind of arrangement." Her laugh came through the phone like breaking glass. "Dad, let's be honest about this. You're 71 years old, living alone in that big house in town. When was the last time you actually used the lake property? Twice last summer? Maybe 3 times the year before that?" The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Since Margaret's death 18 months ago, I'd found it difficult to visit the place where we'd shared so many memories. Every room held echoes of her laughter. Every sunset reminded me of evenings we'd spent planning a future that would never come. But avoiding the property didn't mean I was ready to surrender it, especially not to people I'd met exactly twice at family gatherings. "The frequency of my visits doesn't change the ownership, Sarah. That property represents decades of work and sacrifice. Your mother and I built that place with our own hands." "Oh, please." Her tone shifted to something I'd never heard directed at me before, a mixture of impatience and barely concealed contempt. "You hired contractors for most of the work, and Mom's been gone for over a year now. Holding on to that place like some kind of shrine isn't healthy." I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, but from something deeper and more painful. This was my daughter, the little girl who used to help me measure lumber and hold flashlights while I worked on weekend projects. The same child who'd called me her hero during high school graduation. Speeches was now reducing my life's work to an unhealthy obsession. "Sarah, I understand that Marcus's parents are having difficulties, but there are other solutions. Maybe we could discuss a rental arrangement, or I could help them find something more suitable for their needs." "No, Dad, you're not understanding me." Her voice hardened into something final and absolute. "We've already decided. The lake house belongs to Harold and Patricia now. They're moving in this weekend, and you're not welcome there anymore. They need space to recover from their financial troubles, and having you show up randomly would just create unnecessary stress." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not welcome at my own property. The place where I'd proposed to Margaret on a moonlit dock, where we'd celebrated every anniversary for 3 decades, where I'd taught Sarah to swim in water so clear you could see your feet 12 feet down. Now I was being banned from it by my own child, as if I were some unwelcome stranger rather than the man who'd paid every mortgage payment and property tax bill for 28 years. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "That property is legally mine. The deed has my name on it, not yours, not Marcus's, and certainly not his parents. You cannot simply declare ownership of something you don't own." "Actually, I can and I am." The coldness in her voice was complete now, professional almost, like she was discussing a business transaction rather than dismantling her father's legacy. Harold and Patricia have already hired a moving company. They'll be there Saturday morning with all their belongings. If you try to interfere, we'll have to involve the authorities. I stood up from my kitchen table, pacing to the window that looked out over the small garden Margaret had planted before she got sick. The tomatoes were coming in beautifully this year, red and heavy on their stakes, exactly the way she'd taught me to grow them. She'd never see this harvest, never taste the sauce she'd planned to make, never sit with me on the lake house deck watching sunset paint the water gold and crimson. "Sarah, what's happened to you?" I asked, genuinely bewildered by this transformation from the daughter I thought I knew. "When did you become someone who could steal from her own father and call it a favor to people who are essentially strangers to me?" "Steal?" Her voice climbed to a near shriek. "I'm trying to help a family in need while you sit alone hoarding property you never use. Harold and Patricia are good people who deserve a chance to rebuild their lives. All you care about is maintaining control over things that should rightfully belong to the family." The family. As if her husband's parents, people I'd spent perhaps 6 hours with in total, had somehow become more family to her than the man who'd raised her single-handedly after her mother died. People who'd never contributed a single dollar to the property's purchase, maintenance, or taxes were now more deserving of it than the person who'd worked 16-hour days for 40 years to afford it. "Lynn." "Sarah, I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing here," I said, my voice dropping to the tone I used to use when she was a teenager testing boundaries. "You're not just taking my property, you're destroying our relationship. Once you cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were." "Maybe that's for the best," she replied without hesitation. "Maybe it's time you learned that the world doesn't revolve around you and your precious memories. Harold and Patricia will actually appreciate what they're getting, unlike someone who treats a beautiful lakeside property like a museum to his dead wife." The reference to Margaret as my dead wife, rather than her own mother, revealed something ugly that had been growing beneath the surface of our relationship. This wasn't just about property or financial need. This was about resentment that had been festering since Margaret's funeral, anger at me for grieving too long, for not moving on according to Sarah's timeline, for holding on to memories she wanted me to abandon. "I see," I said quietly, understanding finally dawning. "This isn't about Harold and Patricia's financial troubles. This is about you deciding that I've mourned your mother for too long, that I should just forget about the life we built together and hand over everything we worked for to make room for your new priorities. Don't psychoanalyze me, Dad. This is about practical reality. You're alone, you're not getting any younger, and you're wasting resources that could actually help people who need them. Harold lost his job at the plant. Patricia's medical bills are overwhelming them, and you're sitting on a $500,000 property that you visit twice a year to feel sorry for yourself." Each word was carefully chosen to wound, to reduce decades of love and sacrifice to selfishness and self-pity. The daughter who used to bring me coffee while I worked on construction sites before school was now itemizing my failures as a human being to justify taking everything I'd built. "Sarah, I'm going to hang up now," I said, my voice surprisingly calm given the earthquake happening in my chest. "When you're ready to discuss this like adults, you can call me back. But I want you to understand something very clearly. That property belongs to me, and no amount of emotional manipulation or manufactured guilt is going to change that legal reality." "Fine, Dad, be stubborn, but Harold and Patricia are moving in Saturday whether you like it or not. If you show up there and cause problems, you'll be dealing with more than just family disappointment." The line went dead, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a silent phone and the sudden understanding that my relationship with my only child had just fundamentally changed. For 34 years, I'd believed that love and sacrifice would be enough to maintain family bonds. That working myself to exhaustion to provide for Sarah's education, wedding, and various financial emergencies would create lasting gratitude and connection. Instead, I'd apparently created an entitled adult who saw my generosity as weakness and my grief as an inconvenience to be managed. The lake house wasn't just property she was taking. It was the symbol of everything I'd worked for, everything Margaret and I had dreamed of, everything that connected me to the life we'd planned together. I walked to my home office, where Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the desk beside tax documents and property deeds. The deed to the lake house lay in the filing cabinet exactly where it had been for 28 years. My name clearly printed as the sole owner. Legal documents that Sarah seemed to believe could be overruled by her determination and the supposed moral superiority of helping Harold and Patricia. But property law didn't work that way, and I hadn't spent 4 decades in construction without learning how contracts, ownership rights, and legal protections functioned. Sarah was about to discover that emotional manipulation, even when delivered with complete conviction, couldn't transfer title to real estate. The question wasn't whether I could stop her. The question was what kind of man I wanted to be when I did. I spent that Wednesday evening in my workshop, the same converted garage where I'd built Sarah's dollhouse when she was 7 years old. The smell of sawdust and machine oil usually brought me comfort, but tonight everything felt different. My tools hung in perfect order on their pegboard, each wrench and drill bit in its designated spot, a lifetime of organization that suddenly seemed pointless if my own daughter could simply declare ownership of my most valuable asset. The dollhouse still sat on the corner shelf, gathering dust but intact after all these years. I'd spent 3 months crafting every miniature door and window, painting each tiny room in colors Sarah had chosen from paint chips she'd collected at the hardware store. She'd named every doll family that lived inside, created elaborate stories about their lives, spent countless hours rearranging their furniture with the serious concentration of an architect planning a real home. Now that same daughter was rearranging my real home, my real life, with the casual authority of someone who believed ownership was simply a matter of need rather than legal title. The irony wasn't lost on me that the child who'd once treasured a house I'd built with my own hands was now taking the actual house I'd built with those same hands. My phone rang at exactly 9:30, interrupting my brooding. Sarah's name appeared on the display, and for a moment I felt that familiar surge of hope that she'd reconsidered, that the daughter I'd raised was still somewhere beneath this stranger's voice. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation, she said, her tone slightly softer than before. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I want you to understand that this isn't about hurting you. It's about doing what's right for everyone involved. I set down the sandpaper I'd been absently running across a piece of scrap wood. Sarah, what's right is respecting property ownership and family relationships. Taking someone's home without permission isn't kindness, it's theft. That's such a harsh way to put it. Her voice carried that wounded tone she'd perfected as a teenager, the one that used to make me apologize for setting reasonable boundaries. Harold and Patricia aren't stealing anything. They're family now, and family helps family. I thought you taught me that. I taught you that family helps family through support and guidance, not by seizing assets without consent. There's a difference between generosity and having your property confiscated. A long pause stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything that had changed in our relationship. When she spoke again, her voice had hardened back to that businesslike tone that chilled me more than her anger ever could. Dad, I need you to be realistic about your situation. You're 71 years old, living alone, rattling around in a house that's too big for one person while maintaining a lake property you barely use. Harold and Patricia have 3 grandchildren who would love to have a place to swim and play during summers. Which scenario actually makes sense? The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost missed how expertly she'd shifted the conversation from legal ownership to emotional guilt. My age, my solitude, my grief-induced avoidance of the lake house, all transformed into evidence that I was being selfish by maintaining control over my own property. Sarah, those grandchildren aren't my responsibility. Harold and Patricia's financial problems aren't my responsibility. The only responsibility I have is to protect what your mother and I built together. Mom's been dead for 18 months, Dad. The words hit like a slap across the face. She's not coming back to enjoy that lake house. She's not going to sit on the deck watching sunsets with you anymore. All you're doing is preserving a museum to someone who's gone while real, living people could be making new memories there. The cruelty was breathtaking, not just in the words themselves, but in the calculated way she delivered them. Sarah knew exactly how much I missed Margaret, how every room in the lake house held memories I wasn't ready to abandon. She was weaponizing my grief against me, using my love for her mother as evidence of my unfitness to maintain ownership of our shared dreams. Your mother may be gone, I said quietly, but my love for her isn't a character flaw that disqualifies me from owning property. And your complete lack of respect for that love tells me everything I need to know about who you've become. Don't make this about respect, Dad. Make it about reality. You're not the same man who built that construction company. You're older, you're alone, and you're making decisions based on sentiment instead of logic. Harold and Patricia represent the future. You represent the past. The words crystallized something I'd been struggling to understand since our first conversation. This wasn't really about the lake house at all. It was about Sarah's fundamental belief that age and solitude had stripped away my right to self-determination. In her mind, I'd become a relic whose opinions and ownership rights were secondary to the needs of younger, more vital people. Sarah, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. I stood up from my workbench, feeling the weight of decades settling into my bones. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to drive up to the lake house. I'm going to spend the weekend there, in the property that belongs to me. If Harold and Patricia show up with a moving truck, I'm going to politely but firmly explain that they're attempting to move into someone else's home. Dad, don't do this. Don't make things ugly when they don't have to be. I'm not making anything ugly, Sarah. I'm protecting my legal rights. If that creates ugliness, it's because you've chosen to create an ugly situation by trying to steal my property. Her intake of breath was sharp and audible. How dare you use that word with me? I'm trying to help people who need help while you sit there hoarding resources like some kind of miser. I'm sitting here defending my home from my own daughter, which is not a sentence I ever imagined I'd have to say. The sadness in my voice surprised even me. Sarah, do you understand what you're asking me to do? You want me to voluntarily surrender the place where your mother and I were happiest, where we planned to grow old together, where every board and nail represents years of sacrifice and dreams. You want me to give that up to virtual strangers because you've decided I don't deserve it anymore. I've decided that other people deserve it more, she shot back. Harold and Patricia will use it, appreciate it, fill it with family gatherings and holiday celebrations. All you do there is sit around feeling sorry for yourself. The dismissal of my grief as self-pity was the final confirmation of how far we'd drifted apart. The daughter I'd raised would never have spoken about her father's mourning with such contempt. The woman on the phone was someone else entirely, someone who'd learned to see compassion as weakness and ownership as a privilege that could be revoked by moral judgment. Sarah, I'm going to hang up now, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Tomorrow I'll be at my lake house. If you want to continue this conversation like civilized adults, you know where to find me. Dad, wait! I ended the call and set the phone down with hands that barely trembled. Around me, my workshop held the evidence of a lifetime spent building things with patience and precision. Every project had required planning, the right materials, proper technique, and respect for the process. You couldn't force a joint that wasn't ready, couldn't rush a finish that needed time to cure, couldn't shortcut the fundamental steps that ensured lasting quality. Sarah had forgotten those lessons, if she'd ever truly learned them. She thought relationships and property rights could be bulldozed through emotional manipulation and moral superiority. She was about to discover that some foundations couldn't be shaken by threats or guilt, that some structures were built to withstand storms far stronger than family disappointment. I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled out the lake house deed, reading my name in the clear print that had never changed despite everything else that had shifted in my life. Tomorrow, I would drive to the property that belonged to me, not as a nostalgic old man clinging to memories, but as its legal owner asserting his rights. The dollhouse caught my eye again as I turned off the workshop lights. Such a small, perfect thing, built with love for a daughter who'd treasured it completely. I wondered if Sarah even remembered the hours we'd spent together planning its construction, the careful attention to detail that had made it special, the pride she'd taken in showing it to friends who visited. That little girl was gone, replaced by someone who saw her father's life's work as an obstacle to her plans rather than a legacy to be respected. Tomorrow would determine whether anything of our relationship could be salvaged, or whether the woman who'd once called me her hero had truly become someone I no longer recognized. The workshop door locked with a solid click, sealing away tools that had built homes, businesses, and dreams across 4 decades. In 12 hours, I would need every lesson those tools had taught me about standing firm when the foundation was solid, about knowing the difference between compromise and surrender, about protecting what mattered most, even when the people you loved demanded you abandon it. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes mountain air feel like a blessing, even when your heart carries the weight of family betrayal. I loaded my overnight bag into the pickup truck at exactly 7:30, the same methodical timing that had governed my construction schedules for 43 years. The 2-hour drive to Lake Tahoe stretched ahead like a pilgrimage to sacred ground I'd earned with every overtime shift and weekend sacrifice. The highway unwound through California's foothills with familiar precision, each curve and elevation change marking my distance from the life Sarah thought I should abandon. My phone sat silent in the cup holder, its black screen reflecting nothing but my determination to reach the property before Harold and Patricia's moving truck could claim what didn't belong to them. I'd spent the previous evening making calls, the kind of strategic preparation that had kept my construction business profitable through 3 recessions and countless difficult clients. First call went to my attorney, Marcus Webb, whose after-hours availability reflected 30 years of friendship built on mutual respect and professional competence. Fred, you're absolutely within your rights to occupy your own property, Marcus had confirmed, his voice carrying the certainty that came from decades practicing property law. If anyone attempts to prevent your access or remove your belongings, they're committing trespassing and potentially conversion. Document everything, stay calm, and call law enforcement if necessary. The second call had gone to the Placer County Sheriff's Department, where Deputy Rodriguez had listened to my explanation with the patient professionalism of someone who'd mediated family property disputes before. "That's right. Sir, as long as you can prove ownership with documentation, you have every legal right to be on your property," she had explained. "If other parties claim ownership without proper legal documentation, that's a civil matter that needs to be resolved through the courts, not through possession of the premises." Armed with legal clarity and moral certainty, I'd slept better Wednesday night than I had since Margaret's funeral. The righteous anger that had sustained me through Sarah's manipulations was crystallizing into something more powerful. The calm determination of a man who'd finally stopped confusing family loyalty with self-destruction. The turnoff to the lake appeared exactly where it had been for 28 years, marked by the weathered wooden sign that still bore traces of the paint Margaret had applied during our 3rd summer there. She'd insisted on doing the lettering herself, practicing the strokes on scrapwood until her Lake Vista Drive looked professional enough to match the dignity of our achievement. My property sat at the end of a private road, surrounded by pine trees that had grown from saplings into towering sentinels during our decades of ownership. The house itself appeared unchanged from my last visit 6 months ago, its cedar siding weathered to the perfect silver gray that only time and mountain weather could create. The dock extended into water so clear it seemed like polished glass, reflecting morning clouds that drifted across peaks still crowned with snow despite the advancing season. I parked in the same spot I'd been using for 3 decades, beside the fire pit where Sarah had roasted marshmallows during childhood visits, where Margaret and I had shared countless evening conversations about retirement dreams that cancer had stolen away. The familiar crunch of pine needles under my boots felt like coming home after a long exile, even though the exile had been self-imposed grief rather than family banishment. The front door key turned smoothly in the lock I'd installed myself, revealing rooms that held the accumulated comfort of years spent creating the perfect retreat. Margaret's reading chair still faced the window overlooking the water, her bookmark still marking page 237 of the mystery novel she'd never finish. The kitchen held appliances we'd chosen together, countertops we'd measured and installed, cabinets built to accommodate her height and my reach. Every surface, every corner, every carefully selected detail represented joint decisions made by 2 people who'd believed they had unlimited time to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Now, one of those people was gone, and their surviving partner was being told by his own daughter that grief disqualified him from maintaining ownership of their shared legacy. I unpacked my bag in the master bedroom, hanging clothes in the closet beside Margaret's summer dresses, which I'd never found the strength to remove. The morning light streaming through windows we'd positioned to capture the lake's changing colors illuminated dust motes that danced like memories in the still air. This was my sanctuary, my connection to the woman I'd loved for 34 years, the place where her presence felt most real despite the finality of her absence. At exactly 10:15, the rumble of a large truck engine broke the morning silence. Through the bedroom window, I watched a white moving van navigate the narrow road with the careful precision of professionals who'd done this countless times before. Behind it followed a silver sedan that probably carried Harold and Patricia Thompson, the virtual strangers who'd somehow convinced my daughter that need trumped legal ownership. I walked to the front porch with the measured steps of a property owner greeting uninvited guests, my hands steady despite the magnitude of the confrontation ahead. The moving truck stopped beside my pickup, its diesel engine ticking as it cooled. Two men in company uniforms climbed out, consulting clipboards and surveying the house with the practical assessment of workers planning a complex job. Harold emerged from the sedan first, a man in his mid-60s with the soft build of someone whose physical labor days were long behind him. His wife, Patricia, followed, clutching a purse and wearing the nervous expression of someone who suspected this situation might not unfold as smoothly as promised. Both of them looked like decent people caught in circumstances they didn't fully understand, which made Sarah's manipulation of their desperation even more unconscionable. "Excuse me," Harold called out as he approached the porch, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who'd been told this would be simple but was discovering complications. "Are you Fred Martinez? Sarah said you might be here, but that you'd already agreed to the arrangement." The lie was so casual, so complete, that it took my breath away. Sarah had told them I'd agreed to surrender my property, that my presence here was some kind of formality rather than the desperate defense of a man protecting his life's work. These people weren't malicious invaders, they were unwitting participants in my daughter's deception. "I'm Fred Martinez," I confirmed, stepping down from the porch to meet them at eye level. "And I'm afraid there's been a significant misunderstanding. I haven't agreed to any arrangement involving this property. In fact, I specifically told Sarah that no such arrangement was possible." Patricia's face crumpled with confusion and embarrassment. "But she told us you'd decided to let us stay here while we get back on our feet. We've already given notice on our apartment. Our belongings are in storage, ready to be moved." The human cost of Sarah's manipulation became clear in that moment. She hadn't just lied to me about their desperation. She'd lied to them about my cooperation. Harold and Patricia had made irreversible decisions based on promises my daughter had no authority to make, leaving them homeless and dependent on property they had no legal right to occupy. "I'm very sorry for the confusion," I said, meaning it completely. "But this property belongs to me, and I never gave anyone permission to move in. Sarah spoke without my knowledge or consent." Harold's face darkened with the realization that he'd been used as a pawn in a family conflict he'd never understood. "That's impossible. Sarah showed us the paperwork, said everything was arranged. We wouldn't have come here without proper authorization." The mention of paperwork sent ice through my veins. What documents could Sarah have fabricated to convince them they had legitimate claim to my property? "The deed was in my filing cabinet at home, unchanged since the day I'd paid off the mortgage. No power of attorney existed, no transfer of ownership, no rental agreement signed by anyone with legal authority to create one." "What paperwork did she show you?" I asked, dreading the answer. Patricia fumbled in her purse, withdrawing a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. "She gave us copies of the property transfer, said you'd decided to put the house in her name so she could help families in need. We have a lease agreement signed by Sarah as the owner, along with a letter from you explaining your decision." My hands trembled as I examined the documents, each page more shocking than the last. The property transfer bore my forged signature, witnessed by names I didn't recognize, but notarized with an official-looking stamp. The lease agreement granted Harold and Patricia 1 year of rent-free occupancy in exchange for property maintenance and upkeep. The letter, supposedly written by me, explained my decision to donate the property to Sarah's charitable efforts, praising Harold and Patricia as deserving recipients of generosity. The sophistication of the forgery was breathtaking. Every document appeared authentic, complete with legal language and proper formatting that would fool anyone who wasn't the actual property owner. Sarah had invested significant time and money in creating false paperwork, convincing enough to deceive not just Harold and Patricia, but probably a moving company and anyone else who needed to verify their right to occupy the premises. "These documents are completely fraudulent," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My signature has been forged, and I never authorized any transfer of ownership. Sarah created these papers without my knowledge to support a lie she told you about my willingness to give away my property." The moving crew had been listening to our conversation while unloading equipment from their truck. The supervisor, a weathered man who'd obviously handled complicated situations before, approached our group with professional caution. "Folks, we've got a problem here," he announced, consulting his own paperwork. "We were hired to move belongings into this property based on a signed lease agreement, but now the property owner is saying no such agreement exists. We can't proceed without clear authorization from whoever actually owns this place." Harold's voice cracked with desperation. "We paid the deposit, signed all the papers, gave notice on our apartment. Our stuff is in storage waiting to be delivered here. Sarah assured us everything was legal and proper." The tragedy of their situation wasn't lost on me. Harold and Patricia were victims of Sarah's deception as surely as I was, manipulated by someone they'd trusted as family, left homeless and financially vulnerable by lies they'd had no reason to question. Their desperation was real. Their need for housing genuine, their belief in Sarah's authority completely understandable given the sophisticated fraud she'd perpetrated. But understanding their situation didn't change the legal reality. This was my property, purchased with my money, maintained with my labor, legally owned without any dispute or encumbrance. Sarah's charitable impulses, however genuine, couldn't override property law or grant her authority to dispose of assets she didn't own. "I'm truly sorry for what Sarah has put you through," I said, addressing Harold and Patricia directly. "But I cannot allow you to move into property you have no legal right to occupy, regardless of what documents she fabricated to convince you otherwise." Patricia began crying quietly, the weight of their impossible situation finally breaking through her composure. Harold put his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet with tears he was trying to hide from the moving crew and me. "What are we supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're supposed to be out of our apartment by tomorrow. Our storage unit is paid through the end of the month. Sarah said this was our chance to start over after everything we've been through." The human wreckage of Sarah's manipulation spread before me like debris from a natural disaster. 2 elderly people made homeless by my daughter's lies, a moving crew whose time and equipment had been wasted on a fraudulent job, and me standing in front of my own property having to prove my right to occupy it. The scope of deception required to create this situation demonstrated planning and calculation that chilled me more than any angry phone call could have. Sarah hadn't just tried to steal my property in a moment of desperation. She'd orchestrated an elaborate fraud involving forged documents, false promises, and the exploitation of vulnerable people who'd trusted her as family. The daughter I'd raised had become someone capable of breathtaking cruelty disguised as compassion, someone who could destroy multiple lives while convincing herself she was performing acts of charity. The moving supervisor stepped forward, clearly eager to resolve a situation that was costing his company time and money. "Mr. Martinez, we're going to need to see proof of ownership before we can make any decisions about proceeding with this job." I pulled out my wallet and retrieved the folded copy of the property deed I'd brought for exactly this purpose. The legal description, parcel number, and my name as sole owner were clearly printed in official county records that couldn't be disputed or forged. Harold examined the document with the careful attention of someone whose hopes were crumbling with each word he read. "This shows you as the owner," he admitted, his voice heavy with defeat. "But Sarah showed us papers that said you'd transferred ownership to her. How's that possible?" "Because my daughter committed fraud," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "She forged my signature and created false documents to convince you that she had authority she doesn't possess. You're victims of her deception, just like I am." The moving crew began reloading their equipment with the efficient movements of professionals who'd learned not to get emotionally involved in family disputes. Their supervisor approached me with a clipboard and apologetic expression. "Mr. Martinez, we're going to have to cancel this job based on the ownership dispute. Our company policy doesn't allow us to move belongings into properties where ownership is contested. Harold and Patricia will need to make other arrangements." Harold sank onto the porch steps, his face in his hands, while Patricia continued crying beside the car that contained everything they owned except what was locked in storage across town. The practical implications of their situation were staggering. No place to live, limited financial resources, belongings scattered between storage and their car, and the realization that someone they'd trusted as family had deliberately destroyed their lives. But as sorry as I felt for Harold and Patricia, I couldn't solve their housing crisis by surrendering my property to fraudulent documents and emotional manipulation. Compassion didn't require self-destruction, and helping them wouldn't be accomplished by rewarding Sarah's criminal behavior with success. The moving truck's engine roared to life as the crew prepared to leave, taking with it Harold and Patricia's hopes for stability and fresh starts. They sat in their car for several minutes, probably trying to process the magnitude of their situation, before Harold finally started the engine and backed slowly out of my driveway. As their car disappeared down the mountain road, I stood alone on the porch of the property I'd defended, surrounded by the silence that followed victory in a battle no father should have to fight. The lake stretched before me, unchanged by human drama, reflecting clouds and mountains with the same serene beauty that had drawn Margaret and me here decades ago. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that my own daughter had orchestrated this entire catastrophe through lies, forgery, and the calculated exploitation of desperate people. Sarah hadn't just tried to steal my property. She'd revealed herself to be someone capable of depths of deception I'd never imagined possible. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, Sarah's name appearing on the screen with perfect timing. She'd probably been waiting for confirmation that Harold and Patricia had successfully moved into my property, ready to present me with a fait accompli that would force my acceptance of her charitable redistribution of my assets. Instead, she was about to discover that property law couldn't be overruled by forged documents and moral superiority, that some foundations were too solid to be shaken by manipulation and lies. The conversation ahead would determine whether anything remained of our relationship, or whether the daughter I'd raised had truly become someone I could no longer recognize or trust. I answered the call with steady hands and clearer purpose than I'd felt in months, ready to teach Sarah the difference between charity and theft, between helping others and destroying family. The education was long overdue, and the lesson would be one she'd never forget. "Dad, please tell me Harold and Patricia are getting settled in properly." Sarah's voice carried that familiar tone of someone who expected confirmation of their victory, not the sound of defeat I was about to deliver. "Sarah, your friends aren't moving in because this property belongs to me, not you, and I never gave permission for anyone to occupy it," I said, watching a hawk circle lazily over the water that had witnessed this entire drama unfold. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before, a crack in the confidence that had driven her to orchestrate this elaborate deception. "What do you mean they're not moving in? Everything was arranged. The paperwork was signed. They gave notice on their apartment." Each word came out more frantic than the last, as if speaking quickly enough could somehow change reality. "The paperwork you forged, you mean?" I settled into one of the porch chairs Margaret and I had bought during our 10th summer here, feeling strangely calm despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. The documents with my signature that I never signed, authorizing a property transfer I never agreed to. Another long pause, this one heavy with the weight of exposure. Sarah was calculating, trying to determine how much I knew, how much I could prove, how much damage control she'd need to manage. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about. Harold and Patricia showed me papers they said came from you. If there's some confusion about signatures or authorization, we can sort it out like adults." The audacity was breathtaking. Even caught in an elaborate fraud, she was attempting to shift responsibility, to present herself as an innocent intermediary rather than the architect of this entire scheme. The daughter I'd raised to value honesty above all else had become someone who could lie with such practiced ease that I wondered how long she'd been deceiving me about other things. Sarah, I examined the documents. I saw my forged signature, read the fabricated letter supposedly written by me, reviewed the fraudulent lease agreement you created. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was some kind of miscommunication. Her intake of breath was sharp and audible, the sound of someone whose careful plans had just collapsed completely. For 34 years, I'd been the accommodating father who avoided confrontation, who chose peace over principles, who'd rather absorb mistreatment than risk damaging our relationship. She'd built her entire strategy around that version of me, never considering that grief and betrayal might forge something harder. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, she said, her voice shifting to the pleading tone she'd used as a child when caught in mischief. Marcus is furious about his parents' situation. They're good people who've had terrible luck, and you have this beautiful property sitting empty while they're facing homelessness. So you decided to solve their problem by stealing my home and forging legal documents? I stood up from the chair, pacing to the porch railing where Margaret used to stand feeding birds from her palm. Sarah, do you understand that what you did is criminal fraud? You could face felony charges for forgery and conspiracy. Criminal fraud? Her voice climbed toward hysteria. I was trying to help people who needed help while you sit alone hoarding property you never use. That's not fraud. That's compassion. The twisted logic was almost impressive in its completeness. In Sarah's mind, her good intentions somehow transformed criminal behavior into moral superiority. She'd convinced herself that need justified theft, that her assessment of my property usage overrode legal ownership, that fraud became charity when practiced against family members. She'd decided we're too selfish to deserve their assets. Sarah, listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd once used to manage construction crews and difficult clients. Compassion doesn't involve forging documents. Helping others doesn't require stealing from your father. What you did was fraud, plain and simple, and the only reason you're not facing criminal charges is because I haven't decided whether to press them yet. The threat landed exactly as intended. Sarah's breathing became rapid and shallow, the sound of someone finally understanding that actions carried consequences, even when performed with family members who'd historically absorbed abuse without retaliation. You wouldn't, she whispered, but the certainty had drained from her voice. You wouldn't have your own daughter arrested. The daughter I raised wouldn't forge my signature and lie to desperate people to steal my property, I replied. I'm not sure who you've become, but that person has already demonstrated they're capable of things I never imagined possible. Through the phone, I could hear Marcus's voice in the background, asking questions Sarah couldn't answer without revealing the scope of her deception. The conversation was muffled, but his tone suggested growing alarm as he began understanding that their elaborate plan had not only failed, but potentially exposed them to serious legal consequences. Dad, please, Sarah said when she returned to the phone, desperation bleeding through every syllable. Harold and Patricia are sitting in their car in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant because they have nowhere else to go. Their apartment lease ended yesterday. Their belongings are in storage. They trusted me when I said this was arranged, and now they're homeless because you're being stubborn about property you barely visit. The manipulation was so familiar, so practiced, that I almost fell into the old pattern of guilt and accommodation that had governed our relationship for years. Sarah knew exactly which emotional buttons to press, how to transform her criminal behavior into evidence of my heartlessness, how to make me feel responsible for consequences she'd created through deliberate deception. But standing on the porch of the property she'd tried to steal, surrounded by memories of the woman who'd helped me build everything Sarah now felt entitled to redistribute, I felt something different than the usual guilt. I felt clarity. Sarah, Harold, and Patricia's situation is tragic, but it's not my fault or my responsibility, I said, watching afternoon shadows lengthen across water that had reflected the same mountains for thousands of years before human drama arrived to disturb its peace. Their homelessness is the direct result of your lies, your forged documents, your promises that you had no authority to make. You created this crisis through fraud, not compassion. So you're just going to let them suffer because you're angry at me? Her voice cracked with tears that might have been genuine, or might have been another manipulation technique. After today's revelations, I could no longer trust my ability to distinguish between Sarah's authentic emotions and her theatrical performances. I'm going to let them find appropriate solutions that don't involve criminal fraud or the theft of my property, I corrected. There are legitimate ways to help people facing housing crises. Creating false documents and lying to everyone involved isn't one of them. Marcus's voice grew louder in the background, clearly agitated as the implications of their situation became clear. I caught fragments of words, fraud, felony, criminal charges, that suggested he was finally understanding that Sarah's charitable impulses had potentially exposed their entire family to serious legal consequences. "Dad, what if we could work out some kind of arrangement?" Sarah asked, grasping for any solution that might salvage something from her failed scheme. "Maybe Harold and Patricia could rent the property from you at a reduced rate, or we could set up some kind of lease-to-own situation that helps everyone." The offer revealed how completely she still misunderstood the situation. She was still trying to negotiate terms for Harold and Patricia's occupancy of my property, still operating under the assumption that her assessment of their need created some obligation on my part to provide solutions. The fundamental principle, that my property belonged to me and required my consent for any arrangement, remained beyond her comprehension. "Sarah, I'm not negotiating terms for anyone to occupy my property," I said firmly. "This house belongs to me. I choose who stays here, when they stay here, and under what conditions. You don't get to make those decisions for me, regardless of how worthy you think the beneficiaries might be." "But they have nowhere to go," she protested, as if repetition might somehow change the legal and moral realities she was confronting. "Their storage unit rent expires at the end of the month. They don't have enough money for deposits on a new apartment. This could have solved all their problems. This could have solved their problems by creating new problems for me," I replied. "Problems I never agreed to accept, involving people I barely know, based on arrangements you made without my knowledge or consent. That's not charity, Sarah. That's theft with good intentions." The late afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the lake surface in shades of gold and crimson that Margaret had always called God's daily masterpiece. She'd never see another sunset from this deck, never again point out the way light danced on water, or how evening shadows transformed familiar landscapes into something magical. But I would see them. As many as I had left, from the property I had defended today against my own daughter's attempt to steal it through fraud and emotional manipulation. The victory felt both essential and heartbreaking, necessary and devastating in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Sarah, I'm going to hang up now," I said, fatigue suddenly weighing on me like a physical burden. "When you're ready to discuss this situation honestly, without lies or manipulation or attempts to make me feel guilty for protecting my own property, you can call me back." "Dad, wait," but I'd already ended the call, setting the phone aside to watch the last light fade from water that had witnessed the end of my relationship with my only child. The silence that followed felt different from the peaceful quiet I'd always associated with this place. It carried the weight of permanent change, the understanding that some words couldn't be unsaid, some actions couldn't be undone, some trust couldn't be rebuilt once it had been shattered so completely. I walked inside to prepare dinner in the kitchen where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals, in the house we'd built with love and sacrifice, surrounded by memories that belonged to me and couldn't be redistributed to others, regardless of their need or my daughter's assessment of their worthiness. For the first time in 18 months, I felt like I was truly home. Not because I was hiding from grief or clinging to the past, but because I'd finally learned to protect what mattered most. Some lessons came late in life, but they still counted when you had the courage to learn them. Outside, darkness settled over the lake with the finality of decisions made and boundaries established. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation, new tests of the resolve I'd discovered today. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the home I'd earned and defended, surrounded by love that no amount of fraud or family dysfunction could steal away. The phone remained silent on the kitchen counter, and for the first time in years, that silence felt like peace rather than abandonment. Some relationships couldn't survive the introduction of honest boundaries, but the ones worth keeping would find a way to respect them. I wasn't holding my breath for Sarah to be among them. The next morning brought a peace I hadn't experienced in months. I woke naturally at sunrise, without the anxiety that had become my constant companion since Sarah's first phone call about the lake house. The coffee tasted better than it had in years, brewed in my own kitchen, in my own home, surrounded by memories that belonged entirely to me. I spent the weekend doing simple maintenance tasks that I'd been neglecting during months of grief and family turmoil. Cleaned the gutters, checked the dock for loose boards, trimmed branches that had grown too close to the windows. Physical work that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this place, why Margaret and I had sacrificed so much to make it ours. Sunday evening, as I prepared to drive back to town, my phone rang one final time. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and something in my chest tightened with what might have been hope. Maybe she'd found the clarity that had eluded her for so long. Maybe the daughter I'd raised was still somewhere beneath the stranger who'd tried to steal my home. "Dad?" Her voice was different now, smaller somehow, stripped of the aggressive confidence that had driven her previous calls. "I need to tell you something." I settled into Margaret's reading chair, looking out at the lake that had witnessed our entire confrontation. "I'm listening, sweetheart. I've been thinking about what I did, about the papers I created, about Harold and Patricia." She paused, and I could hear tears in her voice. "You were right. It was fraud. It was wrong. And I'm sorry." The apology I'd been waiting for, but it came wrapped in a sadness that suggested she finally understood what she'd destroyed in pursuit of her misguided charity. "Sarah, I appreciate you saying that. Marcus and I found Harold and Patricia a temporary place to stay," she continued. "A friend of ours has a guest house they can use while they get back on their feet, the right way, without lies or forged documents or stealing from family." Relief flooded through me, not just for Harold and Patricia's situation, but for this glimpse of the daughter I remembered. The woman who could recognize mistakes and work to fix them, who understood that good intentions didn't justify destructive methods. "That's the right thing to do," I said quietly. "I'm proud of you for finding a real solution." We talked for another hour as darkness settled over the mountains, not about property or legal documents or family obligations, but about memory and loss and the different ways people processed grief. Sarah admitted she'd been angry at me for mourning Margaret so deeply, for holding on to our shared places and possessions instead of moving forward in ways she thought were healthier. "I thought if I could get you to let go of the lake house, you'd finally start living again instead of just existing," she said. But I realized now that wasn't my decision to make. "Grief doesn't follow other people's timelines," I replied, watching stars reflect on water that had remained constant through all our human drama. "And healing doesn't require surrendering everything that connects us to the people we've lost." When we finally said goodbye, something had shifted between us. Not back to the way things were, too much had been broken for that, but toward something new that might be built on honesty instead of manipulation, respect instead of entitlement. The drive home Monday morning felt different than my arrival had 3 days earlier. I wasn't fleeing family conflict or defending territory under siege. I was simply a man returning from his weekend retreat, carrying the satisfaction of boundaries maintained and relationships clarified. Sarah called twice more over the following weeks, conversations that were careful but genuine, rebuilding trust one honest exchange at a time. We talked about Margaret's memory, about the difference between helping others and enabling them, about the responsibility that comes with owning something valuable. Harold and Patricia sent a handwritten note of apology, thanking me for not pressing criminal charges and explaining how they'd been deceived by documents they'd had no reason to question. They'd found jobs, modest ones that matched their circumstances, and were working toward independent housing with the dignity that comes from honest effort. The lake house remained mine, visited more frequently now that I no longer felt guilty about claiming space for my own healing. Each sunset reminded me that some things were worth fighting for, that love sometimes expressed itself through protection rather than surrender. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen windowsill, catching morning light that would have made her smile. I kept them there not as a shrine to the past, but as a reminder that the best parts of love survive even the worst family storms. Some battles end not with victory or defeat, but with understanding. Some relationships can only be saved by nearly losing them completely. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give your children is teaching them that respect has boundaries, even within families built on love. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from the people we love most, but they're often the ones we need to learn the most.